I already knew by repute this man's habit of exaggeration and of self-inflation, yet I could not help being impressed by the earnestness and sincerity of his words. I really believed that I was about to be confronted with something important and hitherto unknown. The low tones in which he addressed me, and the serious expression which lay on the extraordinary parchment-yellow face, were devoid of any hint of the trickery or practical hoaxing which was his habitual attitude toward his own discoveries. I was convinced that this time an issue of first-rate importance was at stake. I answered him in all seriousness. "Please let me assure you, Professor, that only one impulse brought me to you, the thirst for knowledge. For me, science and absolute truth take precedence over all other considerations." I then went on to thank him with genuine feeling for the confidence he was prepared to show in me, though our acquaintanceship was so short and he knew so little about me. "Yes, you have my confidence. I do not know how you have awakened it. I believe that you have toward these things an attitude which differs completely from that of your co-religionists. Actually, the little that we know of the life and acts of that personality with whom we are concerned, and who has unfortunately molded our history of the last 2,000 years, we owe to a couple of your fellow-countrymen, or shall I say, your co-religionists, who have left us their accounts of that life and its activity. They were not free from partisan passion and sectarian interests. These tendencies, ranged on either side of the struggle, have created the figure of that personality. They gave it birth and fashioned its form. You will certainly know," and he pointed a finger at me, "that in the beginning, before the Greco-Roman genius introduced a little order into the labyrinthine chaos of the Pharisaic mentality which dominated the Christian sect, this entire matter of the new faith was a purely Jewish affair. The followers of the new faith and its opponents were both of that human material out of which God had created the chosen people." Despite my preliminary resolution to remain untouched and unmoved by any observation of his, I could not help seeing that theologic disquisitions of this kind threatened to break off our relationship at its very beginning, for he could hardly utter a sentence which was not provocative. I forced myself to answer in the softest and gentlest tones of which I was capable. "Professor, I believe that it would be of mutual benefit if we were to avoid theological discussions which might lead to unpleasantnesses. It would be better for us to confine ourselves to Hebrew instruction and to the factual material." A look of astonishment and anger came into his face, as though he could not understand where I had found the impudence to interrupt his discourse. He muttered something unintelligible between his teeth. Then he lapsed into silence, his searching gaze still fixed piercingly upon me, as though he was at a loss as to what to do next, throw me out without an instant's delay, or first blast me out of my chair. Finally he burst out, "For the sake of science I will put up with everything, even with the insolence of a Jewish whippersnapper." In the literary circles of our provincial city there was one man on whom his intimates had bestowed the title of the theologian or the professor. Himself not a professional writer, he was the friend and counsellor of writers, an aesthete, a philologist of the classic languages. However, from time to time he did put his extraordinary erudition to use, and published observations and brief essays in journals devoted to Roman and Greek history and literature. If, for instance, some scholar had made an error in the name of a Roman general or jurist or philosopher, had given a wrong date, or misspelled the name of a tribune, in brief, if any sin of inaccuracy had been committed against one of the major or minor heroes of antiquity, at once a correction appeared in the following issue. In the majority of cases the editors had either to rewrite the letters or throw them into the trash basket because of their fantastic style. In the first place, his style was severely classical, that is to say, he threw in so many Greek and Latin words that it was quite difficult for a modern reader to know what he was driving at. And then it was his peculiar delight to unearth, from God alone knew which sources, the names of classic heroes of whom no one had ever heard before. There were some who said that many of the names contained in his observations and essays were unearthed out of nothing more substantial than his own imagination. Others, less rash, tried to check up on him, ransacked the various anthologies, dictionaries, and encyclopedias, and arrived at unsatisfactory conclusions. Apparently there was something in the names, though exactly what they could not determine. It was as though this man was in exclusive possession of a peculiar library of Greek philosophers and Roman statesmen, accessible to him alone. Whenever he wrote, it was invariably behind the mask of a pseudonym, which was never the same, but varied from occasion to occasion. always, however, retaining an outlandish and unexpected character. These peculiarities might have passed as harmless eccentricities, but the worst feature about his contributions was his habit of introducing into purely scientific notes violently controversial observations on contemporary individuals and events. He used his brief notices for the purpose of settling his accounts with all his enemies, and in particular he would direct his fury against his bitterest foe, the Jews. On the slender pretext of a newspaper correction, he would hang all the list of their shortcomings. If he had occasion to mention the jurist Cicero, he would never forget to add, "He it was who, 2,000 years ago, already alluded to them as a noisy and tumultuous people." It need hardly be added that in consequence of this monomania, his communications were not particularly welcome to the various editors. As against this, however, it could not be denied that he had his coterie of eager listeners in the café which he frequented. In keeping with the practice of the philosophers of antiquity, he used the spoken rather than the written word in the communication of his wisdom to others. Like some prototype of his in Athens of old, he would take his place at the center of a circle of young listeners, who hung on his lips and gathered up eagerly the pearls which fell from them. I do not know what such a circle, assembled around a Socrates or a Plato, must have looked like, but among those who surrounded the professor were to be seen such as had already lost their first youth, some of them, in fact, displaying the baldness of advancing age. Smoking innumerable borrowed cigarettes, he, an unshaven figure, sat in the cloud of smoke which went up from the gnawed and battered pipes of his disciples. These were drawn principally from the ranks of the untalented and the unsuccessful. It is no exaggeration to say that whosoever had failed in the literary or professional world was attracted to the table in the café, in which was mirrored the intellectual life of the provincial city. In the Polish language there is the word kaval, meaning a piece of trickery, a hoax, a canard. For the sake of a kaval he was ready to sell his father and mother, or to destroy half the world, and if he managed to put it over successfully, he was indescribably happy, and tears of sheer joy would run down his cheeks. It was in connection with such a kaval that his name had at one time appeared in the world press. The incident was connected with the report of an Ethiopian manuscript of the New Testament, which he claimed to have discovered in a monastery on Mount Sinai, with the help, as it appeared later, of a notorious literary forger. Whatever the external upshot of this epoch-making discovery, it ended in a scandal of worldwide proportions. It clothed the man in a mantle of local fame. From that period on he was for ever astonishing the learned world with new, unknown manuscripts of antiquity which he had brought back with him from his long research travels in the Orient. The numerous falsifications contained in these documents had ruined his reputation as a scholar, and yet the attitude of the academic world toward him, essentially suspicious as it was, did not lack an element of interest, for in the midst of these very falsifications there were always such strange, mystic, and unintelligible evidences of authenticity that he seldom failed to divide the ranks of the learned. Time was needed to establish beyond the shadow of a doubt the falsehood of his claims, and somehow this was never done completely, for there always remained behind a lingering suspicion of authenticity. Here and there individual opinions of weight considered the discoveries genuine, or, in any case, thoroughly mysterious. When it so happened that he was caught red-handed in a falsification, his excuse was that he was putting over a kaval on the learned in order to show how essentially unreliable they were. More recently he succeeded in imposing on scholars a deception which made a great stir in the press, and which almost landed him in jail, while his reputation sank to its nadir. One fine morning he issued through the newspapers a statement that he had found in an old church an unknown Josephus manuscript written in ancient Slavonic, which derived from the 10th century and which had escaped the censorship of the church. In this manuscript, he claimed, there was a passage, not to be found in any of the known Josephus texts, relating to the person of Jesus Christ, and shedding on it a peculiar light which vindicated the claim of certain anti-Semitic scholars who would have it that Jesus Christ was an Aryan. It may easily be imagined what storms were roused in the ecclesiastic world. The sequel might have been anticipated. It was established that not only was there no such passage, but that the very story of the manuscript was a wild exaggeration, for what was actually produced was a 2-page fragment of an early Slav chronicle, the genuineness of which could not be definitely proved or disproved. In any case, the incident trailed off into mystery. High representatives of the church prosecuted him for blasphemy. The trial cost him much effort and suffering, but he did not seem to mind. It was at this trial that he first revealed the symptoms of a strange mental disease. He said he suddenly astonished the judges with the statement that he was a contemporary of Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Judea, and had a first-hand knowledge of the incidents which occurred in Jerusalem at that time from his own participation in them. As will readily be understood, this extraordinary sickness remained a strict secret. The court at once perceived that it was confronted with a case of mental aberration. It was profoundly reluctant to make public fantastic statements which could only add to the damage which the incident had inflicted on the Church. The trial was suppressed. But hardly had the tumult raised by this cavil died down, when he tried to provoke another sensation. This time he claimed to have unearthed, in the shop of a Jewish antiquarian located in the old city of Warsaw, nothing more nor less than the papyrus of an unknown version of the New Testament, in which were contained many new sayings and parables of Jesus of Nazareth, as well as a new account of the crucifixion. Coming as it did after the story of the Josephus text, this discovery of an evangelist did not produce the effect it might have produced. Two sensational-mongering papers gave space to it. The learned world ignored it. He himself attributed the attitude of the latter in part to the jealousy of the learned, and in part to the world domination of the Jews, who were determined to keep his discoveries from the light of day, lest the real nature of the tragedy which was enacted at that time in Jerusalem become generally known. Nor was there anyone anywhere who knew as much about the subject as he himself. For various reasons which he was not able to reveal, he would keep the document secret while he continued to prepare it. At the time in which this account opens, that is, when I made his acquaintance, his star had almost completely set. Personally, too, he had declined. He was no longer as witty as he had once been. His inspirations were less frequent and less interesting. It appeared likewise that he had at last exhausted the discoverer's well of unknown sources. He had become old. He was seen more seldom in the café. It was reported that he was now subject to long fits of depression. He remained locked in his room, or else he passed entire weeks in the university library, rooting among books and manuscripts. I cannot quite explain the reasons which drew me so powerfully to this man, and which made me determined to win his confidence and to hear him speak about those days. All I can say is that I have always been profoundly attracted to that period. Hearing that he stood in need of a man with a sound knowledge of Hebrew, I obtained a recommendation to him. I knew that the contact might be far from pleasant, that he would in all probability insult me at every step, but my mind was made up, and the beginning was, in fact, difficult. There seemed to be no genuine contact between us. I swallowed his insults, and wondered whether it was worth while. Then, when the character of his mental condition was borne upon me, my determination was strengthened. The fact that I had before me a contemporary of Pontius Pilate, a man who had lived in Jerusalem and had personally participated in the repression of the rebellions, a man who had been a first-hand witness of the tremendous events of that time, even though this might be nothing more than an illusion, held me bound to him. And I must confess that I even asked myself whether this was not, perhaps, a case of metempsychosis, a reincarnation of someone out of that period, flung across the centuries into ours.